All right, welcome back to the Best Roofing channel. My name is Rome Bailey. I've worked in residential and commercial roofing for about 5 years now. Most of the stuff I am going to cover is going to be residential based because that's where my specialty lies. So today I want to talk about the big 5 shortcuts that I see a lot of roofing contractors make. So if you're a roofing contractor, these are things you want to definitely avoid. And as a homeowner, these are definitely things you want to watch out for and make sure that if you see, it's going to raise a red flag. So let's get right into it. Number 1 is going to be starter strip shingles. So there's a couple different ways I see contractors do this to cut corners, and some of them are really not even cutting corners. Number 2 is going to be your hip and ridge. There's a couple different variances as far as profiles. Number 3, a big one I see is going to be flashing. Number 4 is going to be code items, making sure things are actually brought up to code when it's not there yet, or just adding it when it needs to be. Lastly is going to be using leftover materials. It happens more times than you think. So let's dive right into it. Number 1 is going to be the starter shingle. So let's start with what is a starter shingle. So a starter shingle is actually going to be technically the first course of shingle that's installed on a roof. What I mean by that is it's going to go around the entire perimeter of the roof. And there's a couple different ways that I see installers do this. If you have something called a 3-tab shingle, where it's literally 3 tabs that make up a shingle, the reason these were so popular for a very long time and still get installed today is it's very easy for a laborer to install. You can actually use one shingle for the entire roofing system. But obviously I don't advise this, and there's a couple reasons why. When you're using this as a starter shingle, what most contractors do is flip it upside down, where the adhesive strip that seals the shingles together when it's usually installed as a field shingle is about 5 inches off the edge of the roof or so. So that means you have 5 inches of variable wind lift just around the perimeter, which leaves it very susceptible to wind. Occasionally what I see is even when people use laminated shingles is they'll take the laminated shingle and they'll use that whole shingle as a starter strip as well. There's actually a specific shingle that each manufacturer makes that's specifically designed to be used as a starter strip. This is really important to be used as an individual shingle component, because what it does is it has the adhesive strip about 1 inch off the edge of the roof, meaning that first course of field shingle that gets installed on top of it is going to seal it right there at the edge, preventing wind lift. This is super important. When you see materials arriving the day before the build, check the materials, do research if needed, because anyone that's trying to throw a big warranty on this roof has to have X amount of components from that manufacturer. And if you're trying to get a top warranty or they're promising you one, you may be missing out because they're not using all the correct components. Number 2, to piggyback off of something that can also be used as a hip and ridge, is going to be the 3-tab shingles as well. So there's a couple different profiles of hip and ridge. Hip and ridge, just like it's described, is going to go on your hips, where your slopes meet at an outward angle, and then your ridges, which is essentially your peaks on the very, very top. Most standard hip and ridge shingles are going to be about 1/8 inch thick or so, sometimes a little bit thicker, and that's going to be your standard package across most roofing warranties. These are perfectly fine. What they're going to do is it's going to be kind of similar to a 3-tab shingle, where they're going to come in a bundle of 3, and then they're perforated, they're already pre-cut, you fold them, they tear them nice and clean, and then they're going to color match your field shingles to a T. What I have seen happen is somebody may have something called a high profile hip and ridge, where the hip and ridge is actually twice as thick. It's double layered. A lot of times you see this on a more presidential shingle, something with more of a class 4 impact rated. It's rated to withstand larger hail. It's a much more aesthetically pleasing, but what I've seen happen is somebody already has a higher profile hip and ridge, and then they downgrade them to a seal ridge or some kind of lower hip and ridge that's more standard, and they're going to save and cut money that way. And it's certainly something to watch out for. Number 3, a big one I see, is going to be flashing. There's a couple different kinds of flashing. The one I'm going to really go into is step flashing and counter flashing. These are going to be your most common. These need to be replaced, believe it or not, for most extended warranty. So if somebody has promised you an extended warranty, they need to be replacing the flashing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying every piece of flashing can be replaced. Sometimes the way it's installed, it's actually nailed into the wall, which means you can't just pull it out without maybe removing a bunch of stuff and creating a much bigger expense, but you can still lay over it and create another layer of protection. What I see a lot of contractors do is not replace the step flashing, and this can be very problematic, especially if it's a more galvanized or steel application where it's starting to rust over time. It's going to fail sooner than the next roof needs to be installed. Another big thing I want to touch on is counter flashing. What is counter flashing? So counter flashing actually gets installed on top of step flashing. Step flashing is a 4x4 piece of metal. It's used whenever your shingles meet any kind of wall. It's going to go underneath lap siding, so your hardy, your wood plank, anything of that nature. But if you have a hard surface like a brick or a stucco, it actually gets surface mounted to it if it's a replacement. Once that's surface mounted to it, you have lines that need to be covered, so we put a counter flashing on top of that. Now, there's two different kinds of counter flashing. What I prefer to use is the sticks. That's a solid, thicker metal piece, has a very clean finish, and it's one continuous piece, which means it's less opportunities for separation, expansion, and water to be able to get in there over time. What a lot of contractors do is use something called trim coil. Trim coil has its place in its nature, but as far as a very, very long stretch, it's usually a thinner metal. And what happens is when you roll out a long piece of thin metal, it's going to warp and look bad over time. And this is something a lot of homeowners don't understand, to where it may look okay even on day one or day two. Years down the line, it can warp, it can start to separate, and it's not going to hold the sealant as well as a piece of counter flashing that doesn't. So definitely something to pay attention to when you're asking them all the components or changes they're going to make when they're doing a roof replacement. Number 4, a big one I see a lot of contractors avoid, whether it's due to lack of knowledge or just trying to cut costs, is bringing things up to code. I'll briefly go over drip edge because I talk about it so often. Drip edge has been code in Georgia for about 12 years now. It's an L piece of metal that goes around the perimeter. This is not something I see where a lot of contractors cut corners. It's very rare that I do, but it's super important to be installed around the entire perimeter of the roof. A lot of the times when I see contractors cut corners, whether again it's due to lack of knowledge or not, is something called a cricket on the back of a chimney. So what is that? If your chimney is wider than 32 inches, you need to have a cricket on the back. Don't get me wrong, I don't know why it's called a cricket, but what it is essentially a buildup on the back side of your chimney to where you build in 2 valleys so the water will essentially kick away from the chimney. This is something that was not code for a very, very long time. So when homes are built in the 70s, 80s, and prior, a lot of times I see 5-foot wide chimneys that is just a deadpan valley. And what happens is you usually run into leaks and issues like that, but it can be fixed whenever the roof is replaced. It can actually be fixed if it just needs to be beforehand. I see some sellers bring it up to code when they go to sell the home, but if the shingles are much older, it may make a little bit more sense to just wait until the replacement happens. It's not something you see and it has to be fixed right away, but it's something that should definitely be dealt with during a replacement. And when it's not, it's just going to be problematic because, which, as you can imagine, when you just have a dead valley like that, if you have any kind of trees, leaf debris is going to build up. Shingles are meant to shed water. They're not meant to retain water. So I usually see a lot of issues whenever there's not a proper buildup of a cricket behind a chimney. So just a little detail, if people are showing you photos after it's done, something to definitely ask about. Lastly, number 5 is going to be leftover materials. This is something I don't fortunately see too often, but this is where if you're getting a quote that's substantially lower, you may want to be cautious. So the biggest thing I usually see is when people will piece together a bunch of different brands of synthetic felt. So after the roof's already torn off and they're putting down underlayment, you'll see 4 different colors up there. That means they're using everything under the sun that was left over in a van or left over in the warehouse to try to get the project done to save a little bit of cost. The main issue with this, even if it's installed correctly, is if they're again trying to give you an extended warranty. If they're using various components, that can certainly void your warranty. Another thing I see is when people want to cut corners by using field shingles as ridge cap. And the reason contractors get away with this is because it's above what most homeowners can see. And if you're not rehearsed in what each shingle looks like, it can definitely be something that gets overlooked. So there you have it. Throw it in the comments if there's other things you have seen as contractors and homeowners that raise red flags to you. But those are the top most common 5 ways that contractors I see cut corners. Thanks for watching, guys.